So now we go on to the correlation matrix. So now what the correlation matrix does is it tabulates the correlation coefficients that exist between all of the variables that are involved in our study. So as another example, this study included or it concerned job resources, job satisfaction, emotional well-being, and burnout. So now the correlation matrix will indicate the correlation coefficients that exist between all of our variables of interest. So now let's say that we want to look at the correlation coefficient between job satisfaction and job resources. Okay, I've highlighted over here. Here we found our job satisfaction column. Where does job satisfaction intercept job resources? Okay, right over there. So here our correlation coefficient is. Now what is our correlation coefficient equal to? As we can see, 0.65. Now the first question I'll ask myself when I look at a correlation coefficient is the relationship between those variables a positive or a negative linear relationship? Okay, it's a positive linear relationship. Why do we know that? Because there's not a negative sign in front of the correlation coefficient. Okay, so therefore the correlation coefficient between job satisfaction and job resources is equal to 0.65. So it's a positive linear relationship, and it's a reasonably strong linear relationship. The thing is that I must just say, in these basic examples, we use correlation coefficients of 0.9, but when I've read, all this stuff in articles, like the articles that I've read, I have not very often come across a correlation coefficient that, is higher than 0.5. And that's me. I'm still young. I haven't read a lot of articles, but I have not come across correlation coefficients that are higher than 0.5 on a lot of occasions. But over here we're using examples. Okay, so in this example, I must say this information I just typed in. I didn't get it out of an actual article. Okay, so in any case, in this example, the relationship, the correlation between job resources and job satisfaction is 0.65. Okay. Now moving to, let's say we want to measure the relationship between burnout and emotional well-being. Okay. So we've got burnout, and up there we look at emotional well-being. Okay. So now where's the value of where these two intersect? Okay, it's right over there. Okay. Negative 0.8. Okay. So therefore, it's a negative linear relationship because there's a negative number in front of the correlation coefficient. And what does a negative linear relationship mean? As the one variable increases, the other variable will decrease. So therefore, as burnout increases, emotional well-being decreases. And in this case, the correlation coefficient is negative 0.8. So there'll be a strong linear relationship between burnout and emotional well-being. So, for example, burnout will influence emotional well-being in a negative sense quite strongly, since the correlation coefficient is high. So therefore, the lower the correlation coefficient, the less of an, should I say, the degree of influence that the one variable will have towards the other will not be that strong if the correlation coefficient is lower. The relationship will be there, but it won't be a very strong relationship, whereas in a case such as, for example, the correlation coefficient between burnout and emotional well-being, it's quite a high correlation coefficient, so therefore the degree of influence in the relationship between these variables is quite strong. Okay, so now I'm sure you noticed these digits, the perfect one in the table. Now, have you noticed how wherever these perfect ones are present, that's where the same variable intercepts itself. So therefore, for example, of course, job resources perfectly resemble job resources. So the value of 1 will be the correlation coefficient, and that will be applicable in the case of job satisfaction, emotional well-being, and burnout. All of them resemble themselves perfectly. So in an article, often a researcher will just remove these values and put a dash in place over there. Another thing that I've seen researchers do, in the articles that they write, is that where the variable intercepts itself, they'll put the Cronbach alpha coefficient of the test that was used to measure that variable. So for example, over here, if the Cronbach alpha coefficient of the test that was used to measure job resources is 0.8, they'll put 0.8 over there. Now, the Cronbach alpha coefficient, we'll discuss that later, but so that you know, or you don't start panicking and all of that. The Cronbach alpha coefficient, like it indicates the reliability of the test, or the measure that was used to measure the variable of interest. Now, a test and a measure, they're the same thing. It's like, like I say, they're synonyms in the research jargon. But the whole point, okay, the Cronbach alpha coefficient is often indicated in the case where the same variable intercepts itself in the correlation matrix, and the Cronbach alpha coefficient must be equal to or higher than 0.7 for a test to be reliable. So I'm going to write that down and then put a sticky note on your desk. The Cronbach alpha coefficient of a test must be equal to or higher than 0.7 in order for that test to yield results that are reliable. Okay, so in any case, now moving back to the correlation matrix. Okay, have you noticed how these values mirror each other? Like we've got a 0.65 right opposite of 0.65, 0.5 right opposite each other, and should also be negative, I beg your pardon. Okay, and then a negative 0.8, they just mirror each other, you know. The whole point is that over here, for example, job satisfaction intercepts job resources over here. But where's another column of job satisfaction? Oh, it's over there. And what does it intercept? It also intercepts job resources. So this will happen. The one half of the correlation coefficient, not the correlation coefficient, the one half of the correlation matrix on the other side of this diagonal line over here will always mirror the correlation coefficients that are on this side of the correlation matrix. So therefore, what researchers often do is they just eliminate the top half of the correlation coefficients, because all of the information will be, you know, presented in the bottom half of the correlation matrix. Okay, so like I say, of course, we've mentioned this table is the correlation matrix. Now, another thing that a person will notice is sometimes numerical values are put in the columns of the correlation matrix, especially the top columns over here. So now I know that can be confusing a person. So a person first looks at that and you're like, no, where do these values come from? Or, I mean, these numbers. So I'll tell you what all of that is about now. Okay. So now in a correlation matrix, to write the full value of, I'm just trying to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, no. Okay, moving on. Okay. Now in a correlation matrix, if you think about it, in an article we've got limited space. So therefore, sometimes people get scientific terms that are very, very long. They would like take up the whole of these columns. So now therefore, to save space, what researchers do is they use numbers to refer to the variables in the correlation matrix. So here, for example, I'm numbering the variables. Job resources is referred to as 1, job satisfaction is referred to as 2, emotional well-being is number 3, burnout is number 4. So therefore, this column refers to job satisfaction. So therefore, you have an article, right? Sorry, that's not referring to job satisfaction, I beg your pardon. That is referring to job resources. Okay, let me just remove these, the coloring. Okay. So now, job satisfaction, okay? Over here, which column refers to job satisfaction? Okay, number 2 does. Okay, so now if we go to number 2, we go down here, oh, this is job satisfaction intercepting emotional well-being. So this indicates the correlation coefficient between those variables. Okay, what was number 3? Number 3, is emotional well-being. So therefore, if we look at emotional well-being, this value intercepts burnout. So therefore, this value indicates the correlation coefficient between emotional well-being and burnout, since it intercepts burnout's column. Okay, so now if we go to a correlation matrix, such as over here, okay, now over here I must just say M would refer to, let's see what the, well, they didn't really label things, but usually M refers to the mean, which is the average, and SD refers to the standard deviation, but we're not worried about those right now since we are looking at the correlation coefficients. So okay, and like, remember what I said about these would refer to the Cronbach alpha coefficients, but it's because at the bottom of the table it says that the values that are in between brackets refer to the Cronbach alpha coefficients of the tests that were used to measure the construct. So for example here, job satisfaction, the Cronbach alpha coefficient of the test that was used to measure that was 0.9, but in any case we're not interested in that right now. We are looking at the correlation coefficients. So I will first ask you, what is the correlation coefficient between work engagement and job embeddedness? Okay, so here's work engagement. Where does it intercept job embeddedness? Okay, now let's look at job embeddedness. Number 3 is used to refer to job embeddedness because, like I said, imagine if they had to write all of the full names out here, like we wouldn't have space for the page, so therefore they just refer to them with numbers. So in any case, what was the question? The correlation between work engagement and job embeddedness. Okay, so we've got work engagement. Which number refers to job embeddedness? Okay, job embeddedness is number 3. So where's number 3? Okay, there's number 3. So now we look at work engagement. Okay, work engagement. Where does it intercept number 3? Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, so the correlation coefficient between work engagement and job embeddedness is equal to 0.6. So is that a positive or a negative linear relationship? Yes, it's a positive linear relationship, and it's a reasonably strong positive linear relationship. Okay, so now we want to look at the relationship between self-rated performance and turnover intention. Okay, so what we see, you see now, because like turnover intention is not in this column. So what are we going to do? Okay, what number refers to turnover intention? It's number 8. So let's go to number 8. Where does turnover intention intercept self-rated performance? We see number 5 refers to self-rated performance. So we go along turnover intention. Where's number 5? Oh, okay. There, it intercepts number 5. So the correlation coefficient between turnover intention and self-rated performance is negative 0.2. So now it's a negative number. So what does that tell us about the relationship between self-rated performance and turnover intention? It's a negative linear relationship. Okay, so then is it a strong or weak negative linear relationship? Okay, well 0.2, yeah, that's not a very strong linear relationship between turnover intention and self-rated performance. Okay, so should we look at one more example? Okay, what is the correlation between effective commitment and, let's say, co-worker rated performance? Okay, well, if we look over here, effective commitment, we see that the values aren't really indicated there. So then we go to co-worker rated performance because we see it's got a lot of values in its column. Okay, so under the row of co-worker rated performance, where does it intercept number 2? Because number 2 refers to effective job commitment. It intercepts number 2 over there. Okay, and there we can see the correlation coefficient between co-worker rated performance and effective commitment is equal to 0.14. Okay, now remember, a correlation coefficient will never be greater than 1, so it'll always be, usually be 0.14, for example, in this case. Okay, so yeah, there we can see the correlation coefficient between co-worker rated performance and effective commitment, and it's a positive linear relationship. Why? Because a negative value is not present in front of the correlation coefficient, so therefore it's not negative, so it's a positive linear relationship. Okay, so now let's see, quickly want to look at the other example of regression. Oh, no, sorry, not regression, I mean correlation, I beg your pardon. Okay, now don't worry about this stuff. Okay, so here we're looking at correlation coefficients between the variables of organizational support, sorry, growth opportunities. We're just looking at the numbers here. Growth opportunities, organizational support, advancement, overload, and job insecurity. Okay. But I noticed for some reason over here they did not involve, I know they did involve all of the variables. I beg your pardon. Okay, so in any case, moving on to the correlation coefficients. Okay, now let's look at the comments at the bottom. Okay, so now over here they say this is an asterisk, if I remember correctly. You call that star there the static key, asterisk. Now over here they say that if an asterisk is present next to the correlation coefficient, it means that the correlation coefficient is statistically significant. Now what statistically significant would mean is that the correlation did not just occur by random chance. So therefore, of course, we want our correlations to be statistically significant, and in this case, the authors did indicate that their correlation coefficients, they indicated those that are statistically significant. Okay. Now often, or I would say all the time, from what I know, a person only takes statistics into account if they are at least statistically significant. Okay, but in any case, moving to the correlations. Okay, so we're going to look from here on, just indicating, leave the, okay, this is the mean, the average, in other words, the standard deviation, and this value, or sorry, the symbol indicates the Cronbach alpha coefficient. So therefore, here they're indicating the Cronbach alpha coefficients for each of the tests. And like we said, the Cronbach alpha coefficient indicates the reliability of the measure that was used to measure the construct of interest. So for example, the measure, like I say, a measure and a test are synonyms in research jargon. So I'll just keep that to, I'd rather say test because I don't want to confuse people. So now the test that was used to measure the growth opportunities in the study had a Cronbach alpha coefficient of 0.86. And like we said, it must be at least 0.7. The Cronbach alpha coefficient must be 0.7 or higher. Now this is above, and that meets the minimum requirement, and it's above, so it's, yeah, it's a reliable test. So in any case, that is just so that you don't wonder what all of these things mean. And yeah, maybe you should also make a note of what, you know, we just spoke about with the Cronbach alpha coefficient. That's if you didn't do it the first time. But in any case, okay, so moving on to the correlation coefficients. Okay, let's look at the correlation coefficient between advancement and overload. Okay, zoom in a bit. Excuse me. Okay, Cronbach alpha coefficient between advancement and overload. Okay, so here's our advancement row. Okay, where's overload? Oh no, we don't have overload over here. So what do? We go to number 4. Okay, overload's over there. What is advancement represented by? By the number 3. So there, or excuse me, we're going to look at where overload intercepts advancement. However, we can see over here, the correlation coefficient, it says negative, but it's basically next to 0. And like we saw earlier on, a correlation coefficient of 0 would indicate that no linear relationship exists between the two variables of interest. So for example, in this case, they're saying there is basically no relationship between overload and advancement. This is what this study is suggesting. In any case, so that is the correlation coefficient between overload and advancement. Okay, so let's look at the correlation coefficient between job insecurity and organizational support. Okay, we've got job insecurity over here. What is organizational support? Referred to by which number is it referred to? Look over here, okay, 2. So therefore we're going to look at where job insecurity intercepts 2, intercepted over there. So over here, the correlation coefficient between job insecurity and organizational support is negative 0.11. And we can see over here, said that it's statistically significant because a star is next to it. Now, see, I didn't discuss the practical significance, but we'll get to that just now. So, like we were saying, we see over here that the correlation coefficient between job insecurity and organizational support is a negative relationship, and it's equal to 0.11. Now, what does a negative relationship mean again? It means that if a negative linear relationship exists between two variables, it will mean that as the one variable increases, the other variable will decrease. So, okay, I'm trying to, excuse me, get back to my train of thought. Okay, job insecurity, organizational support, we saw that it's a negative relationship. So therefore, as organizational support increases, job security should decrease. So that is what we are suggesting by the negative relationship between the two. As organizational support increases, job insecurity should decrease. And like we see by the asterisk over there, this correlation between the two variables was found to be statistically significant. Okay, and 0.11, what does that tell us about the relationship? Yeah, it does exist, but it's not very strong. So Yeah, so that's the correlation between those two variables. Okay, now if we look at getting back down here to the comments at the bottom, they say that a plus will indicate that the correlation coefficient is practically significant with a medium effect, while two plus signs, or I'm not sure exactly what you'd call those terms in this case, but those signs, two of them will indicate a practical significance of the correlation between those variables and that it has a large effect. So from what I understand about practical significance, I believe that they're basically insisting that this relationship should lead to practical like change, you know, in the case of an intervention. So for example, organizational support and growth opportunities was found to be practically significant with a large effect. So therefore, they're saying that in practice, if you provide more support from your organization towards an individual, their growth opportunities should increase. And now that's a very, you know, that's got potential. So the way I said, okay, let's say I support this person more, maybe then they believe more in themselves and they start to actually take more risks, or, you know, accept or go against more challenging, but, you know, growth, promotion. Oh, sorry, excuse me, my English is bad this morning. But okay, let me get back to the beginning. I beg your pardon. Okay, so in terms of the practical significance of the correlation between organizational support and growth opportunities, this should suggest that this relationship, the correlation between growth opportunities and organizational support, they're suggesting that the correlation that they found is so strong that if you manipulate either of the variables, it should lead to a practical change of behavior in the other. Okay, so for example, better organizational support should practically lead to an increase in growth opportunities. Okay, so look at one more example. And like I said over here, I would have asked you, is this a positive or a negative linear relationship? And over here, they say that if it has two plus signs, it means that it's practically significant with a large effect. And they say that something has a large effect if it has a correlation coefficient of 0.5 or higher. So let's look at one more correlation coefficient. Okay. Let's look at the correlation coefficient between advancement and organizational support. If we have done so, I'm not sure, but we'll just go through it again in case. Okay, so okay, advancement and organizational support. Okay, so let's look at advancements row. Okay, does it intercept number 2, organizational support? Does it intercept it? Oh, yes, it does. Okay, so there the correlation coefficient is. Okay, so now what does this tell us? Okay, look at the value. What type of linear relationship is it? Yes, it's a positive linear relationship. Okay, now what does that star tell us? If we look at the bottom, okay, statistically significant. So therefore that correlation coefficient did not just occur by chance. The plus sign, as we see in the sub-comments, tells us that this correlation coefficient is practically significant with a medium effect. Okay, so therefore I hope that this video helped you in terms of reading and understanding correlation coefficients. Yeah, no, just keep practicing, it will come with time. Yeah, all the best of wishes.